For this week's assignment, we're going to use the Mixer Brush tool in Photoshop to create a fine art painting. For our first step, we're going to find a photograph that we'd like to use. I've already found a photograph of an owl that I'm going to be using for my painting, and I've opened it up inside Photoshop. I'm going to come over to the Layers panel. Remember, if your Layers panel is not visible, you can find it under Window and Layers, or the hotkey is F7. And the first thing I'm going to do is to right-click on this background layer, and I'm going to choose Layer from Background. This is an option, move this dialog box in here so you can see it, that's the first option when you right click, and it's going to open up a dialog box that's the new layer dialog box, and I don't need to change any of these settings. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And then in my layers panel I'm going to choose the lock option that's the black lock. The reason I do this is my background layer by default is a layer that I can paint on, but I don't want to be able to paint on this layer inside of Photoshop because I want to use it as my reference. So with the mixer brush, we're going to be able to actually pull the colors right out of this photograph and use them as our paint. And so we won't have to figure out what colors we need for our photo. We'll just use the ones directly out of the image. So I've started by creating this layer and locking it. This last lock option prevents us from moving it or painting on it. Now I'm going to create a new layer with my new layer button. And we're going to do this a lot in this assignment. I'm going to double click on it, and I'm going to name this one Feathers, because I'm going to start with the feathers of our bird kind of around here, around the eye socket. And the next thing I need to do is get my mixer brush. My mixer brush lives in my tools under my brushes panel. Notice in the brushes, if I hold that down, we have the brush tool, the pencil tool, the color replacement tool, and the mixer brush tool. The hotkey for these is the letter B. And if I hold down the Shift key and select the letter B, it will cycle through or toggle through the brushes in the brushes tool. So here I have the brush tool, the pencil tool, the color replacement tool, and the mixer brush tool. The mixer brush tool button looks like a paintbrush with a drop of water above it, and we'll notice in the option bar we have a whole different set of options now. The ones that are really important for this assignment are going to be the brush selection dialog. That dialog box is found in the second spot. I can change here the size of the brush and the hardness of the brush, and I can also choose from many different tip shapes, brush tip shapes. The second option here is the brushes panel. This panel is accessed, the hotkey is F5, or I can use this little button and it will open up this big panel. This also allows me to change the brush tip size, choose a brush tip shape, but I can also change other options here, like I can create a brush that scatters, or I can add some texture to a brush using patterns inside of Photoshop, or I can change the way that the ink builds up on the brush. The way the colors are affected. In this case, we're really only going to use the brush tip shape options because we're going to choose from these brushes and take a look at the way that they are going to make strokes down in the brush sample area right here in the dialog box. So that dialog box is accessed through this toggle here. The next spot we have is our paint color. This is derived from our foreground color, or in this case, if we choose this option right here called Load Brush, this button, we need to make sure we load the brush with each stroke, and also that we clean the brush with each stroke. We have some additional options. Under here are some presets. We can choose a dry brush. That's going to change the wetness and the loading of the brush. A moist brush, or we can choose just the custom default. I tend to like a reasonably wet brush. somewhere around 50%, 50% wet and 50% loading, and a mixture of 50%. That's the default, that's just the moist brush. The other thing we're going to want to check is make sure that we have the sample all layers box checked. And this box is super important because this box is going to use all of the colors beneath my cursor as the paint color. So to begin, I'm going to choose a brush that I like. I happen to be pretty fond of this round brush myself. And so if I choose my brush dialog box, it shows me that this is a flat curved brush. I get a little picture of what the brush looks like. I can change the length of my brush tips, bristles. I can change the thickness. And notice as I do this, it changes the preview and the way the brush is going to look. I can change the size, make it larger or smaller. I can change the thickness of the bristles, the percentage of bristles, the angle of the brush stroke, the stiffness of the brush. And all of these things are going to affect the way that my brush reacts when I paint with it in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and close this panel now that I have a brush I'm pretty happy with. I'm going to make this brush much larger. I'm using the square bracket key on my keyboard to make this brush larger. That key is usually right above the return key or the enter key on the right hand side of the keyboard, and I can use the if I use the right hand bracket, so the end bracket, that makes my brush larger. If I use the left hand bracket or the beginning bracket, it makes my brush tip smaller. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to come work with the feathers right here by the eye of my owl. I'm going to start just right here in this area, and I'm going to get my mixer brush tool, and now as I click and drag my brush, notice I get this really beautiful painted stroke, just like I had really wet paint on a canvas. This assignment is going to be a little bit time consuming because you have to pay attention to all the details. So as I work through this area, notice Photoshop is pulling the colors. I'm going to close this little preview. Pulling the colors from the picture right where I start my stroke. And one of the really neat things about this assignment is that I can add layers of detail by adding a new layer. I'm going to rename this one. We're going to call it Small Feathers. I like to name my layers in this assignment to make sure that I don't forget what I'm doing. And I can turn on and off a layer. If I turn off this feathers layer, and I come in here with a much smaller brush, so again I'm using that opening square bracket key, and as I come in here and pull out of different areas, Photoshop looks at the pixels beneath my cursor and pulls those colors. And uses them as the colors for my painting. And I can take these layers, turn them on and off, move one above the other to get the texture that I want. I'm going to turn that feathers layer off again and really pull out some of the feathers right here up against the eye. And just step by step, this is a time-consuming project. That's why this week you only have you have 2 weeks to complete the assignment and only 3 paintings to do in that time, because it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of attention to detail. You may actually work on these assignments in more than one sitting. A lot of our other projects you've been able to do and get up or just complete the entire project in one sitting. This time I think you might need, in some circumstances, to work on something and work on it until you feel like you're finished working for the day, and save it and come back tomorrow and work some more. The next layer I'm going to work on is this eye. I think that eyeball is so beautiful, such a pretty orange. So I'm going to name this one Eye. And I think I want a different brush, so I'm going to get my brushes panel and I'm going to choose a different shape. And if I come look at that, it's pretty small. I might want it just a little bigger, a little bit thicker. Oh, maybe that fan brush. The fan brush. I think that's what I might want right there. And so I'm going to come right in here. Notice as I change the angle, when I bring my brush over here, I have a different angle on the brush, and so it behaves differently when I move it. And I can zoom way in. I obviously got right in there in some of those orange colors. And there's my mixer brush. And sometimes we're going to make a layer we don't love so much, and we might want to throw it out and start over. I'm going to name this one Eye. And I'm going to clean my brush so I have nothing there to start with, and I'm loading my brush after each stroke, and I'm cleaning my brush after each stroke. And I'm going to change my brush a little bit here. I want a wetter brush, so I have a little bit more load and a little bit more mix. And as I paint on this layer, this eye layer, I want to always pay attention, make sure I'm on the layer I think I'm on. As I click and drag, it's going to pull those beautiful orange colors. I want to make sure I've sampled all layers checked. And I'm actually going to turn a couple of those layers off. We'll get rid of all those, so I only have that. And there's that pretty orange. I'm going to undo parts of it. There we go. And sometimes I may want to make just little brush strokes. Sometimes I may want to make much larger brush strokes. Sometimes I may want to pull from the brightest part. Sometimes I may want a smaller brush or a different brush. This is a assignment that requires lots of experimenting, lots of working, lots of playing. I love assignments that encourage students to play, and that's one of my favorite things about this assignment, is absolutely you're going to be encouraged to play, because we're going to clean that brush again and pull some of that orange. In playing in this assignment, you're going to get really neat textures in your painting. If you look at paintings online or in museums, you'll notice that paintings have such great, incredible texture and fantastic colors, and so we get some really neat things in pictures and in paintings. So we can turn our layers back on, our little feathers and our big feathers. Then as we zoom out, we notice we can turn off parts of our owl, turn off our photo. And this, you're just going to keep working on this assignment until you have it all finished. We'll call this big feathers. Photos that are good for this assignment are things like animals, flowers, Oh, there, that's really pretty. Sometimes your brush will be a little bit slow, so you may need to be a little patient here and there. And when we get to the beak, we'll want to come in and be really cautious and thoughtful about the beak and the texture of the beak. Flowers are good. Pictures of people are difficult, but very good. If you're willing to try that, that's a very good project to do. But I will warn you, people are a little more difficult for this assignment than they are some of the other assignments we do in our class. Now, if you happen to paint over something, like in this example, I painted over the beak and I need to find that beak again, I can turn off all of my layers, make a new layer. I'm going to call this layer beak. And I'm going to choose a different brush because I want something kind of small and detailed for the beak. And I'm going to zoom way in on our beak here. And I'm going to get my mixer brush. And because I've turned everything off, I can just paint right with the beak. I'm only going to get the colors out of that beak. And I can choose a specific color also. So if I want, I can load only a solid color and I can pull it right out of there, or I can choose black and paint with that. And I'm just going to choose the areas that I want to be aware of. In this case, this is the beak right here. And I'm going to I can move that all the way up to the top, turn my other layers on, and pull that element out even though I perhaps painted over it. I'm excited when you're all finished with your painting, or you feel like you're done with it, you're going to save it, File, Save, and when you save it, because it has lots of layers, it's going to want to save as a PSD file or a Photoshop file. And I'm going to call this Owl Painting. In this case, I'm going to call it WIP, Work in Progress. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. Always choose maximum compatibility if you're given the option. And that is going to be your assignment for this week. I look forward to seeing what you do. I'm sure you're going to come up with some amazing projects.